What is it about having a great mealtime together that's relaxing and enjoyable?
Really just a cool time to just like reframe life.
We go around the table and we talk about what was the best part of your day.
If we were home, we sat around the table and had a meal together.
It's super cheesy sometimes, and like, tell me one thing you love about your brother.
I had the same 3 meals, like just over and over and over.
We try to make it where we don't talk about work at all.
Who was the best behaved of the kids?
Oh, me.
Jesus, the night before he died, he sat down and had a meal with his disciples.
There is something about being able to just sit down and have a meal with somebody that is just disarming.
I've been in several groups, and I've seen both sides.
Your group actually becomes your family.
It's a commitment really from everybody that's just like, if we're going to be a part of this group, we're going to be in each other's lives.
Welcome, One Life East, One Life West, and One Life Henderson. And if you did see the Sarah Inman video where she was doing her announcements and things, I think there's a couple of remarks I need to make about that. First of all, it was our anniversary, 10-10-10, just a few days ago. We celebrated our 8th anniversary. And I think that shot of me, I didn't know that was coming, that shot of me banging my head on the door shows up every year. The joke's getting old, don't you think? But also, if you've never been here, if that has no context, I look genuinely unhinged, don't I? I mean, like what in the world was that? He's full-blown psycho leading this place. So it was an illustration, and I did almost black out, and my wife has always regretted that it didn't just knock me out altogether, because that would have gone viral. I would have had my 15 minutes of fame, and I don't know, she would have been profitable off that. So, I don't know how that works. But anyway, also, now on the more serious note, Sarah talked about baptisms. Here in a couple of weeks, we are having a baptism Sunday. If you have never been baptized since deciding to follow Jesus and trust him with your life, that's what you need to do. It's how you show everybody that you've done this, okay? And so they're great days, but we do ask you to go to a baptism class. It's just one class, lasts about an hour and a half, something like that. And think about this. If you were living 2,000 years ago in the ancient church, they would make you to go to classes for 2 years before they would let you be baptized. So we're asking you to go for a morning or an evening or something like that for about an hour and a half. So please do that. It's very, very important. Now, full disclosure here, the subject matter for today, I will say, especially for those of you who may not self-identify as a believing Christian, it may strike you as odd on one hand. It may make you uncomfortable. It might even offend you. Now, that may not be only exclusive to those of you who wouldn't consider yourselves believers in Jesus. It may be for those of you who do. And I'm gonna tell you what the subject is just in a moment, but let me give it a little bit of context. We're in this series called The Table, and the table is a metaphor for the local church. And our goal is to rediscover this whole idea that's very present in the New Testament part of the Bible, where there's this assumption that people who have followed Jesus and who are baptized and say, I'm following him with my life, I'm trusting him, they are a part of these little or sometimes large faith communities called churches. It's just the assumed fabric of how things have gone for 2,000 years. It's just a part of the reality of what they had. And as a matter of fact, we've even said during this series, I know it's very popular to say that people say things like, well, I know you don't have to be a part of a church to be a Christian. And that is true. To be a Christian, you have to face your own moral depravity before God, place your faith and trust in Jesus' life and his death on the cross and his resurrection from the dead, and follow him actively. That's what makes you a Christian. You do not have to be a part of a church to do that. However, I will say this again because I believe it very firmly. You have to be a part of a church to live like one. And that's the assumption inside the New Testament. You have to be a part of a church to live like a Christian, because it assumes all this reality that I'm together with other believers. And that's why during this series, we're also saying go from the crowd in the room down to teams or groups. The expectation here, the ideal here, is that every single person who calls himself a one-lifer will be in a group and serve on a team. Now, if you can't do both, at least do one, because what it does is it narrows down the rooms to where you can have the kind of life that God wants you to, as it's envisioned in the New Testament. Now, the thing about it is, what we have to remember is this is not a negative image. The church, even though maybe some of us have experienced it as negative, and I understand that, the disillusionments that come with it, the hypocrisy we've seen on display, or things of that nature, it makes it where the local church may not be that appealing. But the image given in the New Testament is picture a fully functioning, a well-functioning family. Think of that as a metaphor, sitting at a table, having a great meal, laughing, encouraging one another, kind of smarting off to one another, very familiar with one another. It's your place to belong. It's your place to feel loved. It's your place to have people who care about you. A table, all right? But once you have that image, like I said before, today's topic may strike you as a little bit on the negative side. Because what you need to know, like in all functional families, at this table called the church, we develop intentionally, but we discipline. We develop and we discipline. Today's topic is church discipline. Aren't you glad you showed up? Look at the bright side. It's raining and gray outside, okay? So let's just embrace the day for what it is. Today's topic is church discipline. And what I'm hoping to do, and before you turn me off and kind of get kind of like, okay, I am uncomfortable with that. I really want to hear about that. I'd love to hear something more positive. What I'm hoping to do over the next few moments is at least get everybody to the place where they don't think about it as an absolute negative. That our understanding of what it really is will go up, and that we'll view it as a positive, so much so that we will engage in it because it's a critical and vital part of what God wants for you and I whenever we follow Jesus. And that's the goal, and I'm going to give you a few ways to achieve that goal. And the first one's this. If you want to, understand the idea of church discipline and get to a place where you view it as a positive and even go so far as to do it, you have to face the reality. You have to face the reality, or acknowledge the reality of it. And what I mean by that is this. If you were, intellectually honest, and say you're not a believer at all, and you're going to explore this thing called Christianity, and you go ahead and read, you're in a hotel room, and you pull that Bible out that's in the nightstand, and you decide, okay, I'm going to check out what Christianity is all about. I've got an open mind. I'm just going to let it speak for itself what it is. And you start with the life of Jesus, and you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and then you read on beyond that, you will encounter it. It will be there. Intellectual honesty demands that you go ahead and acknowledge that it is a reality of Jesus' life and beyond that. Here's what you'll notice about Jesus. Here's how he chose to do his life. He gathered up some immediate followers. He's famous for the 12, but he also had a number of others beside, men and women, who would follow him around. And he encouraged them, he challenged them, he taught them, he enlightened them, he gave them great experiences. He gave them power to do things on their own as well. He did all this stuff, but at the same time, he also, a number of times, he corrected them. He disciplined. He even rebuked them. My favorite moment was one of his main guys did something, and Jesus turned around him and said to him point blank, said, "Get behind me, Satan." Called him Satan. How'd you like to try to recover from that blow from Jesus himself? And you're like, me? That would be a little tough, right? So Jesus wasn't always just kind of patting people on the head. Now you would say, well, that's Jesus. Well, if you read on, you'll discover that these early communities called churches that were throughout the Roman Empire, they engaged in discipline. As a matter of fact, the coaches, the preachers and teachers were coached to, when they preached, you were supposed to encourage, you're supposed to comfort people, you're supposed to teach people. But there is a verse that says that you're also supposed to correct and even rebuke people. And a rebuke is kind of this strong sort of, you're headed that way, don't go that way, kind of jerk you back in line. Now, I've actually had people, I think I've told you this before, I've had people coming to me every now and then, I get kind of amped up a little bit, and I raise my voice, and I yell. And I've had people literally say to me, "I love it when you yell at us." I don't know what's wrong with those people, but I've had people say that to me, like, "I want to be yelled at. I know I need correction. Shake some sense into me. Take the chance, So every now and then that does happen. It's supposed to be a rebuke. And I'd be happy to do that today For all of you, okay? But acknowledge the reality of it. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the reality of it. One is found in a general sense, because you'll find specific instances of discipline, but you'll find a lot of general things in Jesus' life and in the life of the church. And here's one. It's on the night before he dies. He's gathered with his disciples, and Jesus says this: "Anyone who loves me will obey my teaching. My Father will love them and will come to them and make our home with them. Anyone who does not love me will not obey my teaching. These words you hear are not my own. They belong to the Father who sent me. Anyone who loves me will obey my teaching." Now here's a mild corrective, but a very important one. You see, it's very tempting for all of us to think that to love Jesus is to have positive feelings about him. And, sing songs with, oh yeah, I have a positive image of Jesus in my mind. I have positive thoughts about him. But you need to know that that's really not expression of love for Jesus. It can be in a sense, but always remember this. Jesus' true love language is obedience. He wants you to be a person who looks at his teachings and goes, okay, I get it. This is what I'm going to do. I was headed that way in my life, and I'm going to head this way in my life. I'm going to respond to this situation the way Jesus would want me to and how he teaches, as opposed to how I want me to. And sometimes he's aware. We can deceive ourselves into thinking, just because I have positive feelings about Jesus in a particular situation, I can go the opposite direction of what he says, and still it's all okay. But he's saying that's a deception. You don't love him if you're doing that. You're just kind of kidding yourself. Now you can hear the rebuke inside of that and the instruction inside of it. Now I also want you to keep that in mind as we go to the more specific, classic passage on church discipline. It's actually found in Matthew chapter 18, and we're going to read that, remembering the thing that we just did read. And I'm going to kind of walk you through it, and then we're going to kind of hopefully dive a little bit deeper into it. Listen what it says. If your brother or sister sins, which may happen occasionally, go and point out their fault. No awkwardness there. You ever had anybody do that to you before? I had one girl in our office that apparently the whole office was talking about how I dressed, not in a good way. And she got elected to go in and be the one that someone's got to say. It wasn't a sin. Well, maybe they did think it was a sin how I was dressing. But you may think it's a sin how I'm dressing right now. But that was kind of the thing, and someone had to go show me my fault, and she did. She doesn't work here anymore, but it doesn't say you can't respond that way. Oh, you show me my fault? Well, I'll show you a fall down the street. Go there. I hope you enjoy working there. I'll let you decide if I'm telling the truth or not. If your brother sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you've won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they refuse to listen, tell it to the church, and if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector. Now, this is right out of Jesus' words and mouth, and again, it's present. And intellectual honesty demands that you see, okay, there's something, and it's picturing the community. Now, it's noteworthy a few things. First of all, when you have someone sin against you ever had that happen before? People just wrong you. I've had that happen. Of course, we've all had that happen, and it wasn't how I dressed. I didn't, and I've wronged other people. You basically have 2 choices in the church. Number 1, and there is a passage that says, love covers over a multitude of sins. In other words, we find ourselves doing that. You really need to be of the mindset that people are going to bump up against me, they're going to wrong me, they're going to do something, and I really don't think that this process is reserved for every fault that comes your way. If it did, we get really, really annoying, okay? I'm bringing friends around, we're sitting down and having an intervention about the fact that you spoke to me with a little bit sharp edge in your voice or something like that. It's not for everything. There's a general sense in which we all, when we're wronged by someone, we have one choice, and that is cover it over. Just let it go. But here's the deal. You've got to really let it go. You've got to really forgive it for real before God. And the problem is, and what this passage is responding to, is the very real life thing that no matter how offensive you may find this or how primitive you find it, if you really think about it, it is genuine wisdom. Because what do we typically do when someone wrongs us? We don't go to the person just between the 2 of us and show them their fault. What do? We go to every other person in our life except them and point out their fault. And what are we doing when that happens? Especially inside the church, we're creating an image that everybody has of this person against the one that sinned against us. And you know by instinct, I think, that Jesus' instruction really represents maturity, and it represents a real way to go about social relationships. Just between, you notice the privacy there? Just between the two of you. Show them their fault. In other words, I'm not supposed to go to everybody. So I can either cover over the sin and truly cover it over and truly forgive it. That means I don't go around and I kind of plant seeds inside other people of negativity towards a person. Or I can sit down and say, listen, here's what's going on. Now, the implication is that it would be the kind of pattern or treatment or actions or activities that other people would witness. In other words, it's not just your personal little slight kind of stuff. It's patterns that other people would witness. So keep that in mind. Now, even though we say that, I think imagine yourself sitting there, and I want you to kind of envision yourself. What if somebody just sat you down today and said, well, I have a fault that I want to point out to you. How does that make you feel? I know our first reaction is, well, I have a few faults I'd like to point out to you. I mean, we'd all react that way, right? That's just how you do it. That's how you roll. I could have made fun of this lady's clothes. No, I'm kidding. I couldn't have done that. That would have been, then I would be working somewhere else. That's how kind of that works. But, and again, it wasn't a sin. I'm just kind of giving a small situation where you have someone actually sits down with you and says, shows you your fault. How would you react? And inside the discomfort of that, think about this as well. What if you're the person delivering? Now, as we get uneasy with this, what I want to do, believe it or not, on this gray day, is I want to have a little bit of fun with this as well, because to really understand fully this church discipline idea, that's the passage that's classic. That's the passage that churches are supposed to follow if they're healthy and vibrant and good and the relationships are solid. However, I think to more deeply understand it and really have our hearts in the right place, we need to see it on a deeper level. And that's in the context of the entire chapter. Matthew chapter 18, the verse we just read, is an entire thing. And we're going to go through part of it, but you'll understand this verse more, and you'll bring to this kind of idea a better attitude and a better insight if you hear it in the flow of its context, all right? Matthew chapter 18, we're not going to be able to go over it, but I would highly encourage all of your teams and all of your groups, get into Matthew 18. It is rich and beautiful. So we're going to back up to chapter 1 and just kind of do some of the verses that lead up to this point. In our goal of thinking of this, of understanding it more, having a more positive insight into it, but also being willing to do it. Now, before I read the passage, 18:1, here's the context. Okay, so Jesus has been off. There's a clear-cut thing. He's been out of town. He comes back to his hometown of Capernaum. And apparently, many scholars think that he was at Peter's house, the Apostle Peter's house. They found that archaeologically, by the way. They're 99% sure they found the original house that Peter lived in, which is kind of cool. And so he's at this house, most likely, and he's hanging out with his disciples, and they have a discussion. And notice what it says. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and they asked, who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Now, stop right there. Now, the New Testament Gospels, they fully acknowledge that the disciples, the immediate followers of Jesus, did not have a high get-it factor when it came to what Jesus was all about. They themselves acknowledge once he died and he rose again from the dead, they look back and they go, golly, we were wrong about most everything that he said. And the reason that happened was not all their fault. It was a product of their culture. The operating system of their mind and their hearts had been built inside their Jewish culture. When they were on the lookout for the Messiah, they really didn't think of someone who was going to die and rise again from the dead. They thought of someone who was going to live and was going to conquer and was going to get rid of Roman oppression. And so they were waiting for Jesus to do that. And so they would have, these immediate followers, they would have arguments. And the other places in the Bible acknowledge that they would debate over who was the greatest, who's going to have the best seat. They were having an org chart debate. We know Jesus is going to be at the very top of it, but who's going to be next down? Who's going to be? And they would argue about these things. And that's why they're asking who's the greatest. Now, I have to admit, I'm really, really excited about what Jesus himself, I want you to keep this in mind, Jesus himself does what we're about to do, to answer this question. And I want you to imagine yourself, you've just had an argument. Well, I think it ought to be me because I'm better looking. I think it ought to be me because I'm better educated. I think it ought to be me because of where I come from, my family. I think it ought to be me because I'm an entrepreneur, blah, 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 blah. And they're having an argument. They say, who's the greatest? And then Jesus does an illustration that I'm very excited to do because I've shown you pictures. I've told you the saga of having my first grandbaby. And you've seen pictures. But today, you're going to get to meet Judah Lee Morgan, grandson, live, in concert, right here. So we're going to bring him in, and we're going to do exactly what it says Jesus did. And you are more than welcome to give him a thunderous round of applause here at East. Hey! We're not going over there. He does secret. Okay, he and I have rehearsed this once, and this was with none of you in here, and he got very comfortable with this stage. So I don't know how this is going to go like at all right? And there's a lot of stuff up here that he would love to play with, that he would love to look at, and there's guitars and there's things, and he's really, okay. So, but I want you to notice what the passage says. We're going to go up here and read it. He called a little child to him and placed the child among them. So he's probably at Peter's house. He probably grabbed one of Peter's kids in answer to the question. So literally, I'm doing exactly what Jesus did. So I want you to place yourself in an org chart argument first about the greatest, and then it says he placed a child among them. And I want you to see how you're reacting and thinking. First of all, you're thinking, I hope he doesn't knock that table over. So, and we're just going to let him kind of wander. He placed a child among them. Now, I don't know if that child moved around on Jesus, but I'm just gonna let you look at him. And then he says this, listen very carefully if you can hear my words, past all the cuteness. And he said to them, truly I tell you, unless you change and become like, you'll never enter the kingdom of heaven. You'll never even enter it, much less be great. Therefore, who takes the lowly position of this child is greatest in the kingdom of heaven. I know many of you who have been in churches for a long time. I've heard illustrations like this before when we talk about a child's innocence and all the rest. But in this context, especially leading up to discipline, hey, that's a good move right there. He's kind of moving in some spotlight over here. Okay, he's kind of getting used to that. So, and he found a piece of tape that he's trying to go off the floor. Now, if you see it in the context of who's the greatest, what are you thinking? Well, I'm gonna argue that what's really going on here, and Jesus is illustrating, unless you become like this is one of the few times in my life, sorry kid, this is one of the few times in any of our lives where we're completely unaware of social status. We're completely unaware of comparisons. We're completely unaware of merits. In other words, I don't think back in the toddler room he's a dictator or he's thinking he's better than all the other toddlers. Now, he might think that, but I don't think so. I don't know exactly what's going on with that deal right there. Okay, that's a great thing to play with. That's excellent. That's great to play with. He's unaware of social status at all. No merits, no nothing. And what have we repeated over and over and over again in this? That you guys aren't even listening to me, which I kind of knew would happen. I'm sorry. We'll move this table out of the way. All right, so you can keep kind of watching him because you're supposed to. Remember, Jesus said, a child among them. And he said, unless you become like that, he is blissfully unaware of merits, comparisons. He's just living life right now. And how does he view those who are older or larger or maybe, just any kind of status at all? He views them as provisional people who love him and care about him, are there for him and all the rest. Now also watch this. He goes on to say this, and whoever welcomes one such child, I'm watching you, whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me. And then listen to this. If anyone causes one of these little ones, those who believe in me, to stumble, it would be better for them to have a large millstone hung around their neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to stumble. Such things must come, but woe to the person through whom they come. Jesus, up until the passage that we read a while ago on church discipline, gives what I would call the little one speech. And what he's saying is that you have to become this to get into the kingdom at all. You can't see yourself as having any merits or any of that. You are just completely resting your trust. It's not because you compare to others well. But then he goes on to say, now that that was a good look, like, what was that? So, what were we even talking about? What were we talking about? That over there? I absolutely think that up there. Okay. So he gives the little one speech. In other words, he talks about value. He says, once someone comes into the kingdom, this is what it means to come in the kingdom. Once you're in there, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you off because the guy who owns that guitar is a really mean man. No. He gives the little one speech. You know what the little one speech is about? It's about value. It's about protective value. He's really upset that he's not getting to go to the guitar. Do parents view children as inferior to them if they're functioning well? No. Do grandparents view themselves as more valuable than their grandchildren? Absolutely not. I know his other grandparents. I know my wife and I know his parents. And if his life were threatened and I had to remove any of us had to remove an organ and it killed us and it made him live, no problem at all. Why do families, why do people discipline and protect and love? Why am I disciplining him now, keeping him out of stuff he's not supposed to be in? And he's not very happy, incidentally, about it. Because of the extraordinary value that I place on him. Right after that little one's speech, Jesus says, if your brother sins against you. Now, what's the point? And Dad, you can come up and get him now. Would you please give him a hand, incidentally? Whatever. Yeah. Right. Sorry. Kind of looked at him. It's all because of his love for me. Or his love for wanting to touch that guitar really, really bad. The church discipline thing comes out of you become a child. You don't think rank. You don't think comparison. And then he goes on, you think value. What's pictured here, the beauty of this table, is that each of us is so valued by the other that to sit down and show someone their fault is not a superiority thing. It's not a come down on you thing. It's about I value you so highly, I don't want you damaged, I don't want you hurt, I don't want your life destroyed by any action that you're taking. It's not so much about me being sinned against or me being bothered. It's about I see your life could be hurt by what you're doing, and I value you more than my own life. That's the portrait. There's a great book I'd recommend called The Power of the Other. The Power of the Other by a guy named Henry Cloud. He's a psychologist and a theologian. I've quoted him a number of times, just love listening to him talk. But The Power of the Other, I love the subtitle says this: the startling effect other people have on you from the boardroom to the bedroom and beyond, and what to do about it. It's all about, he's done a lot of research into neuroscience and all those things, and what they've come to realize is that other people, our brains are wired to be impacted hugely by other people. It's just a part of science now. Other people have an immense effect on you. And he said, your brain absolutely demands connection. You have to have connection, especially if you want to make progress in life, if you want to get where you're going, if you want to be more like Jesus, if you want to achieve your full potential. Much of it comes down. They've gone so far as to say 100% effectiveness demands 100% the right kind of connection. And he said there's only one of four. We talk about connecting with people and things. He said you can have three of the wrong kind and only one of the right kind of connection. He said one, the wrong kind, is just no connection at all. In other words, you just stay surface with people and people stay surface with you. And you don't let you in, you keep your mask on. Secondly, if you really want to make progress, you can't have a bad connection. There are some people in your life, you ever been with someone that only sees the negative in you all the time? They might acknowledge negatives, but that's all it is. You can never please them at all. They're highly critical, and they're there to beat you down. Third, he said, a false positive connection. This is the most dangerous and subtle one. And what that is you can make connections with people who only tell you the good and aren't willing to challenge your behavior. He said, based on research, there's a fourth category. and it absolutely demands, it's the right kind of connection, is someone who values you, someone who's for you, someone who wants to see you win, and is willing to not only be positive about that, but actually talk out negative things in your life. But not because they're superior to you, not because they think they're better than you, but because they care about where you're going. Guys, that's the portrait of the church. And what they've discovered now is if you want to make progress in your life, you have to have that there. That's the reason I think Matthew chapter 18's there. It's Jesus saying 2,000 years before we figured it out in brain scans that you have to have these kinds of relationships. That's what teams and groups are for. They're to cheer one another, encourage one another, comfort one another, but challenge one another when you're going off the beams. Why? Because you value each other so deeply. That is absolutely vital. Now, across all of our 3 campuses right now, we're going to have our service leaders. They're going to lead you in just a couple of questions to think about, just in response and reflection on what we've just talked about, all right? So we're going to turn it over to Henderson and West at this moment.